In the summer of 1994, a single moment on a football field changed the fate of a man forever. It was not a crime. It was not an act of betrayal. It was simply a mistake, a split-second deflection, the kind that happens thousands of times in football matches around the world. But in a country already consumed by violence, corruption, and the influence of powerful criminal organizations, that one moment carried consequences far beyond the game. 10 days later, Andrés Escobar, a respected defender of a national symbol and one of Colombia's most admired athletes, was lying dead after being shot 6 times outside a nightclub in Medellin. The question that followed shocked the world. How could a football mistake become a death sentence? Behind the tragedy was a deeper story, one of a nation under immense pressure, a sport entangled with wealth and criminal power, and a player who became a victim of forces much larger than himself. For years, the full truth surrounding those responsible remained buried beneath layers of fear, silence, and unanswered questions. The men convicted of pulling the trigger faced justice, but many believe the people who fueled the violence were never truly held accountable. And decades later, as another chapter in this dark story unfolded, the shadows surrounding Andrés Escobar's death returned once again, reminding the world how a single moment in football became one of the most haunting tragedies in sports history. To understand what happened to Andrés Escobar, you first have to understand the city he grew up in. Medellin in the 1980s was not just dangerous. It was, by some measures, the most violent city on the face of the earth, a place where the murder rate climbed into the hundreds per 100,000 people, where car bombs went off in the streets, where judges, journalists, and politicians were assassinated for doing their jobs. At the center of all of it was a single man, Pablo Escobar, head of the Medellin cartel, a man who at the height of his power was reportedly earning tens of millions of dollars a day from cocaine. And Pablo Escobar, no relation to Andrés, despite sharing the same surname, loved football. He loved it so much that he turned it into one of the most effective money laundering operations in the history of organized crime. Drug profits are dirty in every sense of the word. They need to be cleaned, funneled into legitimate-looking businesses before they can be spent in the open. Football clubs, with their loose accounting, their inflated transfer fees, their cash ticket sales, turn out to be the perfect washing machine. So Pablo began pouring his fortune into Atlético Nacional, the most beloved club in Medellin, and almost overnight, it transformed from a regional side into a footballing powerhouse, importing foreign stars, paying salaries no legitimate Colombian club could dream of matching, and refusing to let its best homegrown talent leave for Europe. By 1989, Atlético Nacional had become the first Colombian club ever to win the Copa Libertadores, South America's most prestigious club trophy. The whole country celebrated. Almost nobody asked too loudly where the money had come from, because everybody already knew, and asking out loud in Medellin in those years could get you killed. Pablo wasn't alone. Across the country, rival cartel bosses were doing the exact same thing with their own clubs, almost like feudal lords, each one claiming a piece of the league as his personal trophy case. In Bogotá, an associate of Pablo's named Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, known as El Mexicano, bankrolled the club Millonarios. Down in Cali, the brothers who ran the rival Cali cartel poured their own drug money into America de Cali. At one point, investigators believe at least 6 of Colombia's top professional clubs were effectively owned, in secret, by drug traffickers. Football had become a battlefield for men who already controlled half the country through fear, and now they wanted to control it through trophies too. And it didn't stop at financing clubs. Pablo Escobar would host what amounted to fantasy football games at his private ranch, flying in some of the best players in the country to suit up for teams handpicked by him and his rival cartel bosses, and then betting eye-watering sums of money on the outcome, sometimes $1 million or more on a single private, unofficial match played for an audience of armed men and cocaine kingpins. The players were paid handsomely to show up and perform. Most of them learned not to think too hard about where the paycheck came from. A few, by all accounts, were deeply uncomfortable with it. One of those few, according to people close to the team, was a young, quiet defender at Atlético Nacional named Andrés Escobar. This was the world Andres grew up inside. Born in March of 1967 in Medellin, he rose through the youth ranks of Atlético Nacional at the exact moment the club was being transformed by drug money into a continental power. He could have looked away. He could have taken the easy road that so many around him took, accepting the cash, playing the private matches, staying quiet. Instead, he built a reputation as something almost unheard of in that city at that time. A footballer who seemed genuinely, almost stubbornly clean. He didn't drink to excess. He didn't get tangled in the corruption scandals and bar fights that swallowed up teammates around him. He was polite to journalists, patient with fans, devoted to his family. Sports writers started calling him El Caballero del Fútbol, a gentleman of football, and the nickname stuck because it was true. It mattered more than it might sound. In a country whose name had become internationally synonymous with cartels, car bombs, and a man named Escobar who terrorized an entire nation, Andres Escobar represented something different. He was proof to a lot of people that the name didn't have to mean violence, that Colombia could still produce something the world might love instead of fear. By the early 1990s, that hope had a much bigger stage to play out on. The Colombian national team assembled around that time was, by any measure, one of the most talented groups the country had ever produced, flamboyant, technically brilliant, fearless in a way that felt like a direct rebuttal to everything the rest of the world assumed about Colombia. There was Carlos Valderrama, the midfielder with the enormous blonde afro and a vision for the game that bordered on telepathic. There was Faustino Asprilla, electric and unpredictable up front. There was a goalkeeper named René Higuita who would dribble out of his own penalty box like a man with no fear of consequences. And marshaling the defense, calm in the middle of all that chaos, was Andres, the team's captain. In 1993, during qualification for the upcoming World Cup, this Colombian side traveled to Buenos Aires and did something that shocked the entire footballing world. They beat Argentina on Argentine soil 5-0. It remains one of the most lopsided results in the history of World Cup qualifying. Pelé himself was reportedly so impressed that he tipped Colombia as a genuine contender to win the whole tournament the following summer. For a country that had spent over a decade defined internationally by cartels and bloodshed, this felt like something close to redemption. Hope, real hope, started to build across Colombia, the kind of hope that's almost dangerous because of how much weight people pile onto it. But even before a ball was kicked at the 1994 World Cup, there were warning signs that something darker was riding alongside that hope. Reports would later surface that one of the team's midfielders, Gabriel Gomez, received a faxed death threat ahead of the tournament. Head coach Francisco Maturana reportedly considered resigning under the pressure before the team had even left for the United States. These were not the anxieties of athletes worried about losing a game. These were the anxieties of men who understood, on some level, that enormous and dangerous sums of money were riding on their performance. Money belonging to people who did not lose gracefully. The tournament began, and almost immediately, the dream started cracking. Colombia opened with a defeat to Romania, 3-1, a result nobody had predicted and nobody back home wanted to accept. The team that had humiliated Argentina now looked shaken, fragile, nothing like the side that had carried a nation's hopes onto the plane to the United States. And so, when Colombia walked out to face the United States in their second group match at the Rose Bowl in Pasadena, it had stopped being just a football match. It had become a must-win game, with a country's pride, and according to later reporting, a great deal of someone else's money, hanging on the result. The match was scoreless, deep in the first half, when it happened. An American midfielder named John Harkes sent a low, driven cross into the Colombian penalty area. Andres, reading the danger, stretched out his leg to intercept the ball before it could reach an unmarked American attacker. Exactly the kind of instinctive, defensive read he had made thousands of times across his career. But the ball caught the wrong part of his leg. It deflected, looped up and over his own helpless goalkeeper, and rolled into the back of the net. An own goal. The kind of cruel, random accident that happens in football constantly, in junior leagues and World Cup finals alike, usually forgotten within a week. The United States went on to win that match 2-1. And with that single loss, Colombia, the team many had picked to go all the way, was eliminated from the World Cup in the first round. The country's reaction was instant and brutal. Shock turned to grief, and grief turned to fury almost overnight, and that fury needed somewhere to land. Andres became the face of national humiliation, the man whose own leg had ended the dream. He could have stayed in the United States. He could have waited for the anger to cool from a distance. Instead, he flew straight home to Colombia, refusing to hide. He gave interviews. He wrote a column for a national newspaper, trying to talk the country down from its rage, reminding readers that football, even a heartbreak this size, was still just a game, and that life, his words, more or less, does not end here. He genuinely seemed to believe people would eventually let it go. What he didn't know, and what most of the public didn't fully understand either, was that for some people, this had never been only about pride. Underneath the grief of ordinary fans ran a much colder, much more dangerous current. Illegal betting on football in Colombia at that time was tightly woven into the same cartel networks that had funded the clubs for over a decade, and reporting in the years since has indicated that some of the men connected to that gambling world had wagered extraordinary sums on Colombia's tournament run, money tied to figures with deep links to organized crime in Medellin. An early elimination wasn't just an emotional disaster for those men. It was a financial one. And in a city where disputes over far smaller amounts of money had ended in bombings and assassinations for over a decade, that was an exceptionally dangerous thing to be on the wrong side of. It is worth pausing here to understand exactly how far that culture of violence inside Colombian football had already gone, because it puts what happened next into a far more disturbing context. Years earlier, in a match between two of Pablo Escobar's own clubs, a referee made a controversial call disallowing a late goal. According to multiple accounts, Pablo was furious enough about the decision that he ordered the referee killed. And within days, that referee was shot dead. This was the environment professional football existed inside in Colombia by the early 1990s. Officials had been murdered over disputed calls. A sitting minister of justice had been assassinated years earlier for going after the cartels too aggressively. Death for the men running this underground economy was simply a tool used whenever something or someone cost them money or threatened their interests. Against that backdrop, an own goal that wiped out a fortune in bets wasn't a footnote. It was a motive. 10 days after the own goal, on the night of July 2nd, Andres went out with a group of friends to a nightclub in Medellin, by most accounts trying to do something normal again, to step outside the storm that had swallowed his life since the World Cup ended. Later that night, in the parking lot outside, he crossed paths with a group of men, reportedly connected to two brothers from a powerful Medellin family with deep, well-known ties to organized crime. Witnesses say an argument broke out, fueled by mockery over the own goal, and that Andres, never one to back down from defending himself verbally, answered back. The confrontation escalated with frightening speed. One of the men with them, a driver and bodyguard for the family, pulled a handgun and opened fire. 6 shots fired at close range, while the man allegedly shouted the word for goal, with every single pull of the trigger, a deliberate, taunting reference to the mistake that had defined the previous 10 days of Andres' life. Andres Escobar died there in that parking lot. 27 years old, captain of his national team, killed not in some random act of street crime, but by every indication investigators later gathered, executed over a football match. The country went into a state of collective shock that's genuinely difficult to overstate. The prosecutor who took on the case later said that the desire to see it solved ran from the highest levels of government all the way down to the most ordinary citizens in the street, and that public fury toward the suspects was so intense, he believed people would have torn them apart given the chance. More than 100,000 people turned out for Andres' funeral, an almost unimaginable number, transforming his burial into one of the largest public gatherings Medellin had seen in years. A final, overwhelming answer to the question of who this man actually was to his country. The shooter was identified almost immediately. Humberto Muñoz Castro, the personal driver for the two brothers he'd been with that night. He confessed to the killing. He was tried and convicted, sentenced to somewhere around 43 years in prison for the murder. And then, In a detail that still infuriates people who follow the case, he was released after serving only around 11 of those years. But the shooter was never really the center of the mystery. From the very beginning, investigators suspected that Munoz Castro had not acted entirely on his own, that the order, or at the very least the rage that triggered it, had come from above him, from the two brothers he worked for, men with reported ties to a powerful criminal network that had grown out of the old Medellin cartel structure after Pablo Escobar's death the previous year. Those two brothers were investigated. They spent over a year in custody on charges related to obstructing the investigation. And then, without ever being formally charged with ordering the murder itself, they walked free. The prosecutor who built the original case later admitted publicly that he never understood why the investigation into the brothers was effectively shelved by his own superiors, and acknowledged hearing theories that a powerful paramilitary figure connected to the family may have paid to make the deeper inquiry disappear, though he said he could never confirm it. For 30 years, that question sat there, unresolved. Who really gave the order? A trigger had a name and a face and a prison sentence attached to it. The mind behind the trigger did not. In the family of Andres Escobar himself, there's a detail that almost sounds like something out of Ghost Story. Years after the murder, his young nephew would recall that, as a small child not long after the own goal, he had turned to his mother and said, with a child's unfiltered certainty, that they were going to kill Andres. Nobody took it as anything more than a child's anxious imagination at the time. In hindsight, it reads like a premonition nobody wanted to believe. 4 years after the killing, Andres Escobar's name became inseparable from a single sentence. The line from that newspaper column he wrote in the days before his death, telling the country that life goes on, that this game, however much it hurt, was still just a game. It's quoted in documentaries. It's etched into memorials. Atlético Nacional fans still mark the anniversary of his death. The line has outlived him by more than 3 decades now, carrying a weight of tragic irony every time it's repeated, because the man who wrote it, trying to calm an entire country down, had only 10 days left to live when he wrote it. And the story, as it turns out, was never quite finished. In February of 2026, more than 31 years after Andres Escobar was gunned down in that parking lot, one of the two brothers long suspected, but never formally charged, with ordering his murder was himself found dead in a restaurant outside Mexico City, shot multiple times. Colombian authorities confirmed his identity. Colombia's own president publicly stated that this man bore responsibility for what had happened to Andres Escobar in 1994, calling it a killing that had scarred the country's reputation on the world stage. By that point, the man had spent decades building a new life in organized crime, eventually placed on international sanctions list tied to drug trafficking networks that grew out of the wreckage of the old Medellin cartel. 3 decades after a footballer was executed over a deflected ball and a gambling debt, the man widely believed to have set that killing in motion met almost exactly the same fate himself. Gunned down without warning, in a country far from home, by people who, as of now, remain unidentified. The case that began with a single tragic deflection off Andres Escobar's leg in the summer of 1994 still hasn't fully closed. It has simply, more than 30 years later, claimed one more name.